How did the 2004 Indian Ocean Tsunami reshape the world? What lessons have we learned from one of the most devastating natural disasters in history? On December 26, 2004, the world was struck by a cataclysmic event that would forever alter the course of history. The Indian Ocean Tsunami, triggered by a massive undersea earthquake off the coast of Sumatra, Indonesia, would become one of the deadliest natural disasters ever recorded, with its impact reverberating across the globe. But how deep does the ripple effect of that momentous tragedy extend? How have the affected regions, both in terms of physical damage and human lives, coped over the past 2 decades? And what does the world look like today, 20 years after the destruction? The tsunami was set in motion by an earthquake of unimaginable power. Measuring between 9.1 and 9.3 on the Richter scale, the earthquake itself was one of the largest ever recorded in history. It struck with little warning, sending shock waves through the Earth's crust, which in turn displaced an enormous volume of seawater. As the waves rapidly spread across the Indian Ocean, they reached the coasts of 14 countries, including Indonesia, Thailand, Sri Lanka, India, the Maldives, and several others. In a matter of hours, these countries were plunged into chaos. The speed and scale of the waves were beyond comprehension. Traveling at speeds of up to 500 miles per hour, the tsunami's waves hit land with terrifying force. In some places, the waves were as high as 30 meters, nearly 100 feet, crashing through coastal villages, towns, and cities. The destruction was complete. Homes, schools, hospitals, and businesses were flattened, while entire communities were washed away. An estimated 230,000 people lost their lives, with millions more injured, displaced, and traumatized. Those who survived were left to cope with the unimaginable horror of witnessing their loved ones disappear into the waves, while the very fabric of their societies was torn apart. The economic consequences were devastating. Fishing communities, which were essential to the livelihoods of millions, were decimated, with boats, docks, and infrastructure destroyed. In some areas, the local economy was brought to a complete standstill, as industries dependent on the sea for food and trade were crippled. In tourist-heavy regions, such as parts of Thailand and Sri Lanka, the economic toll was equally severe. Tourism, a major source of income for many, came to an abrupt halt. The loss of life, property, and infrastructure left countries struggling to assess and address the economic damage, which in some regions has continued for years. The environmental consequences were just as severe, with coastal ecosystems devastated by the power of the tsunami. Coral reefs, mangroves, and other vital marine ecosystems were destroyed or heavily damaged, leaving a long-term impact on biodiversity. These ecosystems are crucial for sustaining the health of oceans, providing food, and protecting coastal communities from storms and erosion. The damage was not only environmental but also social, as these ecosystems served as a foundation for the livelihoods of local populations, many of whom relied on fishing for sustenance and income. In addition to physical damage, the social consequences were profound. Entire villages were wiped off the map, leaving survivors without homes, schools, or hospitals. The displacement of millions of people created a massive refugee crisis, with survivors struggling to find shelter and food. In many cases, entire families were lost, leaving survivors to rebuild not only their homes, but their very sense of community. For many, the tsunami's aftermath was as much an emotional and psychological burden as it was a physical one. Communities faced the heart-wrenching task of identifying bodies, providing care for the wounded, and rebuilding social structures that had been torn apart. The trauma experienced by survivors would linger for years, even decades, as people grappled with loss, grief, and the psychological scars of witnessing such devastation. The long-term effects of the 2004 tsunami are still felt today. Many of the affected countries have made significant strides in rebuilding, but in some regions, the scars of the disaster remain visible. Infrastructure has been rebuilt, but entire villages remain abandoned, and the emotional toll on survivors is still evident. In some areas, the task of restoring livelihoods, particularly in agriculture, fishing, and tourism, has proven difficult. In others, the environmental impact of the tsunami is still being addressed, as efforts to restore ecosystems like coral reefs and mangroves continue. Yet as the years have passed, the world has seen a remarkable story of resilience. The affected countries have slowly rebuilt their economies, their infrastructure, and their social fabric. But this recovery has come at a high price. For many regions, the full extent of the economic, social, and environmental consequences is still being understood. 2 decades later, we continue to reflect on the lessons of the tsunami and the ways in which it reshaped the global response to natural disasters. The memory of that fateful day serves as both a sobering reminder of nature's immense power and a call to action for a more prepared and compassionate world. In the immediate aftermath of the tsunami, the world responded with an unprecedented wave of humanitarian aid. Governments, international organizations, and non-governmental organizations, NGOs, from around the globe mobilized resources to provide emergency relief, food, clean water, shelter, and medical aid to the affected regions. The total aid contributed to the recovery efforts exceeded $14 billion, making it one of the largest and fastest mobilizations of international humanitarian assistance in history. One of the key lessons from the tsunami was the importance of effective disaster preparedness, especially in terms of early warning systems. Before 2004, the region lacked a cohesive tsunami warning system. The devastating loss of life exposed the vulnerability of coastal populations to such disasters and highlighted the need for international cooperation in improving disaster response infrastructure. In the years that followed, significant efforts were made to establish and enhance tsunami warning systems in the Indian Ocean region. A regional tsunami warning system, known as the Indian Ocean Tsunami Warning System, was set up under the auspices of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization and the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission. This system, which provides real-time monitoring and alerts for tsunami-prone areas, has been instrumental in reducing the risk of a similar-scale disaster in the future. However, the path to recovery was not without its challenges. Despite the influx of international aid, the affected governments and NGOs faced significant hurdles in rebuilding efforts. Political instability, bureaucratic delays, and resource shortages were just some of the obstacles that slowed recovery in many areas. In addition, many affected regions lacked the infrastructure and governance frameworks necessary to handle such a massive rebuilding project. For some communities, recovery has been slow and difficult. In Sri Lanka, for example, the tsunami destroyed coastal villages, but many residents found themselves displaced for years, living in temporary shelters or struggling with inadequate rebuilding efforts. Similarly, in the Aceh region of Indonesia, the long-standing conflict made the task of rebuilding even more challenging. On the other hand, some regions, such as the Maldives, have made significant strides in recovery, thanks to swift rebuilding efforts and strong tourism sectors that helped drive economic recovery. The international community also assisted with both short-term relief and long-term recovery, including the rebuilding of schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. In addition to physical rebuilding, psychological recovery has been an important focus. Many survivors continue to struggle with trauma, grief, and loss. Community-based mental health support services have become an essential component of the recovery process. As we reflect on the impact of the 2004 Indian Ocean Tsunami, the lessons learned from the tragedy are multifaceted. The disaster demonstrated how interconnected the world is, how local events can have global consequences, and how important it is for nations to cooperate in addressing shared challenges. The most significant lesson is the importance of disaster preparedness. Countries in the Indian Ocean region, and indeed the rest of the world, have learned the value of early warning systems and the need for comprehensive disaster management strategies. The creation of the IOTWS and the strengthening of coastal defenses are direct responses to the shortcomings exposed by the tsunami. The 2004 disaster also underscored the growing urgency of addressing climate change and its role in exacerbating natural disasters. While the tsunami itself was caused by a seismic event, climate change has increased the frequency and severity of other disasters, such as hurricanes, floods, and wildfires. The resilience of coastal regions in particular is threatened by rising sea levels, which could make future tsunamis even more devastating. The global response to the tsunami also highlighted the need for sustained international cooperation in disaster relief and recovery. In the years following the disaster, global partnerships in aid and rebuilding efforts became more sophisticated, and the role of NGOs, regional organizations, and local governments in disaster management became clearer. The collaboration between these entities not only helped save lives in the immediate aftermath, but also ensured that recovery was more sustainable and inclusive. Looking ahead, the lessons of the 2004 tsunami should serve as a reminder of the importance of disaster preparedness, climate resilience, and ongoing support for vulnerable regions. The world must continue to invest in early warning systems, sustainable rebuilding efforts, and, most importantly, global cooperation. The fight against the effects of natural disasters is not one that can be waged by any single nation alone. It requires the united efforts of all. As we approach the 20th anniversary of the 2004 Indian Ocean Tsunami, it is an opportunity for all of us to reflect on the importance of global solidarity and preparedness in the face of natural disasters. Let us honor the memory of the victims by committing ourselves to building a more resilient, compassionate, and prepared world, ensuring that future generations are not left vulnerable when the next crisis strikes.